Hello, thank you for joining us for our online debate today on a global view on dynamic tariffs. We're really excited to have you online with us. We'll be getting started in just one minute. We'll just let all of the participants come in the room. While we wait, I would invite you to check out our policy brief on dynamic tariffs. We just published it in the past month, and you'll be able to find links to it throughout our presentation here. So you can feel free to click through and open it up. You can also live tweet with us at FSR Energy. You can always submit your questions to us live during the debate or afterwards using the Ask FSR hashtag on Twitter. And throughout the debate, you can use the chat box to write down your questions. You can use the chat box to discuss amongst each other and introduce yourselves, and then please direct your questions to the Q&A box. This will help the panelists address them in a more efficient way and make sure that we don't miss any. So again, that's use the chat box to just chat amongst yourselves, and then all of your questions should go in the Q&A box. You'll see the two options below. With that, Prad, I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Jess, and hello everybody from sweltering day in New Delhi. We are having a four-way fight with nature right now. That includes locusts, a heat wave, a cyclone, and the coronavirus. But the show must go on. So welcome to our debate on a global view of dynamic tariffs. So dynamic tariffs at a retail level have been used for commercial applications, but more and more now, even at household levels. We have three great panelists to discuss this really relevant topic. We have from the Swedish regulator, the chief economist, Teresa Hinman Persson, Professor Thomas Gomez. He's the director of the Institute of Investigation in Comillas in Madrid. And we have Tiago Barroso Correa, who is the former director of ANIL, the Brazilian regulator, and currently also CEO of Reg E. And he was there when they actually did apply the white tariffs in Brazil. Jess, can we go to the next slide, please? I would like to bring to your attention our policy brief on dynamic tariffs. I think Jess already spoke about it. The link is here. Please take a look as and when required. Please feel free to ask questions about that as well. Next slide, please, Jess. So coming to dynamic tariff for retail, especially at household levels, what we see is that one size doesn't fit all. If you just look at two dimensions, apart from setting the price itself, if we look at two dimensions being the time block length, so how many time blocks with different prices would we have in a year, and also the price periodicity. So how often will the prices in these time blocks be updated? You see that you have real-time prices, something we will talk a lot more about with Teresa today, like in Sweden, where even prices can change every half an hour. And on the other side, we have Japan or even Brazil, which just kept at two blocks. More like Japan, which had just 2 blocks of prices to be adjusted. And there was one regulatory price set during this test, which was in Japan. And in Brazil, it was 3 blocks, I think. Just the next slide, please. Another thing is there are still barriers that exist when you look at really more sophisticated time of use or more sophisticated real-time pricing. One being the physical and ICT infrastructure that is required to make these viable, such as smart meters and the softwares that are required. You see a massive rollout in France, for instance, of smart meters or across the world. Then the second is the market arrangements that are needed in terms of, do you need competition? you need retailers to be able to provide these prices, etc. And finally, and most importantly, also consumer behavior, because you really need to make the consumer aware about the advantages and how to use these and how to respond to these price signals. Just next slide, please. So with that, we'll put you in a spot and we will come to our first poll. So if you had, as a regulator, had to choose for your country or the region that you live in, any one type of retail price for households, would you keep it at a flat rate, where one rate for the whole year? Would you go something in middle, like a time of use with 1, 2, or 3 time blocks of different prices? Or would you really go for the advanced real-time pricing option? Please do submit your answers in the next 30 seconds. Just whenever you think, yeah, oof, so good. We have a middle path here, as we can see. Time of use tariffs coming first. I think nobody wants a flat rate, or very few people think that we should stay at a flat rate. Quite controversial. So let's, with that, we can go right up to our first question then. Just next slide, please. So what were the motivations really for dynamic tariffs? Because we have two regulators where we have amazing implementations. On one side, we have the real-time prices markets, real-time prices, sorry, there's a typo there, in Sweden. And on the other side, we have Brazil, which did go for the white tariffs. So what were the motivations and what were the barriers? But I think before we get to Tiago, because that seems to be the most sought after answer, we'll keep him for the last, and let's start with Thomas. And Thomas, what is the broader perspective within EU and CER? You have worked with Latin America, you have worked with Europe, you have seen the whole story. So please, in 3 or 4 minutes, your opening comments. Thomas, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this interesting debate. For sure, I would say that dynamic prices or dynamic tariffs is something completely new. It's something that is becoming more relevant. And why is that? I would say that the main motivation here is that the new system that we are moving, which is a decarbonized system based on renewables, needs much more flexibility to be efficient. And this efficiency, in the end, is going to bring us better prices and better tariffs for everybody. And why is that? There are two issues here. When we pay the bill, the electricity bill, we have to take into account that we are paying like 3 concepts. One is the energy that in Europe is coming from the market, and it's a free market where there are people participating in that. The networks, which is the part of regulated infrastructure that we have to pay, but also we pay policy costs and taxes. And what we are talking about flexibility and dynamic prices, we have to be taking into account that we refer in 2 different aspects: the flexibility that we need in the market itself, because the market is going to be more and more needed by renewables, and in that case, variability is going to be much higher. Therefore, dynamic prices for consumers mean that having contracts in the market with real-time prices similar to what we see in the wholesale markets day by day. But on the other hand, we have networks, and in the networks, we need also much flexibility in the future, because we have a process of decarbonization of the system, and in that case, we will have electric vehicles, heat pumps, more possibilities for demand response, and in that case, doing some kind of providing flexibility, you as consumer will get better deals for you, you will get reduced prices, and in the end, the system is going to be beneficial from that. because the system in the end, we will reduce the need for new investments in networks. Therefore, take into account that flexibility is needed in the future more than ever, because the demand is going to grow and the electricity demand is going to grow, and also the variables energy coming from renewables need more flexibility. And the way of attracting flexibility is giving the right signals to the consumers. And that is the main message from my side.
So thank you, Thomas. So indeed, it's all about providing the right signal and reaching your regulatory goals. Then moving on to Teresa, Sweden has been having these really advanced dynamic tariffs now for some time. You really went for it, while you see the rest of Europe is generally still more time of use, while Scandinavia clearly has more real-time pricing and more. So what were the motivations of really going so advanced? And did you and what are your experiences from it? Do you see these signals helping with all these issues that Thomas just mentioned? Do you already see, and what are the barriers that you had when you went for these sort of really advanced, sophisticated pricing mechanisms?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting debate. Yes, the Swedish end user market for electricity has been subject to competitions since 1996. So the basic motivation was that it makes economic sense to separate monopoly activities, the network, from competitive activities, supply of electricity, and that more well-functioning markets would contribute to lowering the overall cost for customers. Today, in Sweden, we have approximately 129 active electricity suppliers, and the customers can choose freely among them the supplier they prefer. The companies compete on the market, and the pricing is free. Each electricity supplier, they purchase electricity they need to cover the consumption on the wholesale market, the Nord Pool, or through bilateral agreements with producers. An electricity contract can be either fixed or variable, where the variable price contracts is calculated based on the spot price adjusted for customer power takeoffs, while the fixed price contracts are based on futures prices. We have in Sweden, on the wholesale market, we have four different bidding zones, and we monitor the prices between the bidding zones. And if you just look at how things have evolved over time, the price differences between bidding zones is low. The single biggest element of the price of electricity right now is the cost incurred by electricity suppliers to buy the electricity they need. There are some additional costs for some of the fixed contracts when it comes to hedging costs or and other administrative costs. The challenges we have had is that, for example, what happens when a customer doesn't make an active choice of supplier? Then we have an obligation of the DSO to assign a supplier to the customer. And on average, the price of these designated contracts is 20 to 30% higher than for other types of contracts. The electricity price also is only a fraction of the total cost of electricity for the consumer. And the end user, of course, also pay the network tariff and taxes and VAT. And our challenge when it comes to, we have been looking at the price signal as a key in order to stimulate demand-side flexibility, for example. But in Sweden, the electricity price is less than 40% of the total cost of electricity, and the remaining more than 60% is made up of network tariffs and taxes and VAT. So the price signal is not as clear as it could be at the moment. And therefore, we're also working on how to create the network tariff more dynamic. And that is a work that we started earlier or last year, and that is ongoing at the moment. One other challenge on the consumer side for us has been that some customers would like to have just one invoice. It's a practical issue, and customers have indicated that two separate invoices, one from the network company and one from the supplier, is considered a challenge. However, we think that that's a challenge that will actually ease over time. That was just briefly the Swedish setup at the moment.
Thank you, Teresa. Indeed interesting, and that's a very typical challenge, I think, which we would see across the world of invoicing and straightforwardness, which I did say as consumer behavior, but it goes much beyond. But let's now go to Tiago. Tiago, we see that people are really wanting time of use tariffs. That's what Brazil went for. Of course, you do have a very special system very close to where I'm sitting right now in India. So we look forward to listening from you about the motivations, and you actually went through this whole process of rolling out the white tariffs. So over to you, Tiago.
Hello, Prads. Thank you. And thank you everyone to come and join our webinar. First of all, I think that to answer the questions, we need to have some information about the Brazilian power sector. Actually, in Brazil, you have a huge installed capacity for generation and transmission. The installed capacity is twice the size of the peak load in Brazil. And why is in that way? Because most of our primary source of energy is renewable. So renewable sources have this seasonality and intermittency. So we need to have a higher capacity installed in order to provide security and adequacy to the system. So 83% of the energy sources in Brazil are renewable in terms of installed capacity. Therefore, we have a very variable price, and there is room or interest to have a time of use tariff or real-time pricing to cope with the challenges of a variable price and to signal to consumers how to respond to price of the energy. However, in Brazil, we still have a price in the spot market that is set weekly for off-peak, shoulder, and peak time. So we don't have a real-time price in Brazil yet. That will start only next year. So we have the first challenge is about technology and about technology and design of the market itself also. We don't have smart meters in retail level enough to have a real-time price also. Other aspect is that we have this huge capacity installed in generation and transmission, but to distribution, in the distribution level, we don't have this spare amount of capacity. So it's important to have a signal for a critical peak time in order to reduce the need for investments in distribution level. So the motivation for time of use tariff in Brazil so far is based on the critical peak time and to reduce and shave the peak and flatten the loads in order to postpone investments in distribution level. We have a long experience with this kind of tariffs. The blue and the green tariffs in Brazil. It started in 1968, but it's only for big consumers. It is for industrial ones and office buildings and malls. These big consumers in Brazil are also free. They can procure for any electricity in the market with traders or independent power producers, but they have to pay only for the use of the distribution capacity. So they have this blue tariff that is time of use and seasonal tariff, and you have the green tariff, it is only time of the use. It is for big consumers. But what is more interesting is that in 2018, we start with the white tariff, which is a time of use tariff for retail consumers and low voltage level of the distribution. So in Brazil, these kind of consumers are not free to procure electricity. They need to buy electricity from the distribution company that has jurisdiction on the region of the consumer it's located. So the tariff for electricity, for energy, and for demand is regulated by ANEEL. And we will start with this white tariff also to give a signal for critical peak time and postpone investments in distribution level. And this is eligible. It's not enforcing all consumers. The consumers may or not go to white tariff. We can discuss that further. But the tariff is to using the taxonomy presented by Brad. We have 3 time blocks: one for peak, one for shoulder, with the intermediate period next to the peak, and the off-peak rate. And the tariffs have a price periodicity of a year. That is a problem in Brazil also. We are traumatized with our experience with inflation in the past. So if you have long-term contracts in Brazil with more than 1 year length, this contract cannot change the price, can change the price once a year. So it's impossible now by law to have a real-time price in contracts with long-term periods. I think that is the context, Brad, and we are now open to further questions.
Thank you, Tiago. Really interesting. So I was also looking at some questions with in the blog, and there are some really interesting points that have been made. One of them, Nicolo says that you can, I mean, it's eventually there is a trade-off between transparency and simplicity. I would say, indeed, that's one of the issues right here. And then you combine that with what Teresa said, that you go to extreme transparency with all these dynamics, but in the end, if you're just looking at the wholesale market, it's just 40%. So you have to go maybe beyond. And is this 40% really impacting? So Thomas, do you have any reactions to what Tiago and Teresa said and about these comments that are coming in the chat box?
Well, yeah, really, what it is clear is that dynamic prices are much more complicated in some way. You need complication in terms of the infrastructure to send the prices to the consumers, and also you need the response from the consumers, because if the consumers are not able to respond, they are not going to get any benefit from that. Therefore, complexity means that in that case, the consumers should be well protected in this case. And in the way of voluntary options should be always behind that. I mean, and this is true in Europe, at least when we are talking about dynamic prices in the market, because in these cases, you are free to go to these kind of contracts or not, and be careful, because in that case, is the risk that you are going to have is much higher. Therefore, you have to protect yourself, taking into account that could be happening very high prices events, and in that case, maybe you have to have some kind of backup for responding to those things. Therefore, complexity is clear on that, and regulators should be aware of that. And in the case of the markets, they have clear that, for instance, now we have the European legislation, the new directive, that is promoting these dynamic contracts. But in that case, this is always this is an option for consumers. And in the case of regulators, they are trying to work in the way of the information has to be supplied to the consumers in a more clear way or more transparent way. And also what we have in Europe, that these price comparison tools should be also improve, because for many consumers, this is not is going to be easy. Therefore, it's true that the large consumers already are experts on managing this, going to the market of these dynamic prices. But if we want to involve consumers at the residential level, in that case, it's much complex and it's much risky, probably. Of course, there are going to be benefits, but only for flexible consumers.
Indeed, and when it comes to, I think, competition at the household level, there's always the political economy that comes into the picture, especially when we look at emerging economies. And there was one question here, Tiago, maybe you already answered it in the box about the subsidies for the retailers in Brazil, and how do you think the subsidies impact these dynamic retail prices, and do you see any changes here? So that's one question that came up in the chat box from Mario. So do you want to react to that, Tiago?
Thank you, Mario, for the question. Actually, we need to clarify that we have no subsidy for retail consumers. The problem is that the consumers is paying for subsidy for renewable sources in Brazil. And the renewable sources in Brazil have a discount in the tariff for the use of the grid in distribution and transmission level. The cost of it is allocated in the end consumers, the end users. So we have a discussion in Brazil now to fade out the subsidies for renewable sources. Most of the wind power plants and solar power plants in Brazil now are the most competitive sources in our auctions. So there is no need for subsidy anymore. I believe in that. And now, because of the COVID pandemic's effects in the consumption of electricity, thinking that you have some fixed costs that have to be recovered in the tariff, and now the consumption is dropping, we will have a revision in the tariff in the future, probably. In order to reduce the impact of that, the Brazilian government is managing to have a loan with private banks to support the distribution companies now, and then have the impact in the tariff in the distribution in the next 5 years. I think that it's what Mario is talking about, but it's not actually a subsidy. It's a problem in the tariff methodology that will have to recover some fixed costs. And in Brazil, most of the retail consumers have only volumetric tariffs. If you have tariffs fixed for demand for also retail level, then that is not a problem at all. But since most of the revenues that the distribution companies receive in Brazil come from only volumetric tariff, it will be a problem because the infrastructure will not be paying. And it's there, it's available, it needs to be recovered investments. So that's the problem I think Mario is talking about.
Yeah, true. And then, Teresa, I see lots of curiosity about real-time pricing and how people are reacting to it, and how are you protect. We will get to the more into the discussion about what the last resort is, but what were your experiences with this real-time pricing? Do people respond actively to it? And like what Tiago and Thomas already said about these issues that are coming up, the new ones, and what are maybe the takeaway for countries which are considering more advanced dynamic tariffs?
Yes, people do respond, and people. What we see is that we have a price comparison site. I will come back to that. That's one of the things that we run, an objective price comparison site. So actually the electricity suppliers, they are obliged to report on their most common contracts and the prices of those contracts. And then we run the site so that customers can go in and compare all the terms and the prices. What we have seen from that site is that customers choose, variable price contracts to a higher extent than fixed price contract, and they're fixed, not fixed, but they're fixed for specific terms, but they are still, of course, they follow the spot price. However, we think that the price signal is not as strong as we would like it to be. We see that people don't, and also we have this challenge that prices has been fairly low when you compare to other countries in Sweden. So we haven't been able to, just through price, stimulate demand side flexibility to the extent that we would have wanted, for example. That's why we're also now taking the step that's one of the reasons why we're taking the step, but also working with the network tariff side to create more, to have an improved design of the network tariff. So we actually want the customers to become more active in the market. We see that they switch suppliers. They do. We have, it's between 10 and 15% that switch suppliers each year. It's very hard to say that the ideal switching measure, for example, because if they switch too often, then that can be an indication that actually something is working very poorly in the market, of course. So we want them to switch when it's the right time for them to switch, basically, so that we have informed customers who make the right choices in the market. But we see that they we also take, we're also obliged to monitor customer complaints in the market. So we can also see that actually the major complaints in the market is not on the electricity price side, on the real-time pricing, it's actually on the network tariff side, where we have the most complaints in Sweden.
Yeah, indeed, that's interesting, because also we had a question from Claire about the networks, which you already answered, and you can come back to it more at the end of this discussion, where we think about what the future is going to look like. But I think this takes us very well into the next part of our discussion, which is choices. As regulators, you have choices to make. A lot of questions about it in the forum discussion as well, about what are the choices regulators have to make. You have to protect vulnerable customers, maybe put price caps such as that exist in the UK, or have last resort tariff, last resort, or distribution companies which have to provide these. And sometimes they're more expensive, 30%, like you said, but these are the trade-offs that you have to make. On the other side, we see also there are consumer choices. Something also Nicolo mentioned, that do you have an opt-in, opt-out at one level? Do you give the choice to the consumer whether they want dynamic tariffs, or you make it a compulsory thing that everybody has dynamic tariffs? And then when you have dynamic tariffs, like you said, and which I think you will come back to more in detail, Teresa, here is menu of tariffs. Do you give them as many options as they want, so that they can really customize their choice based to their needs, or you really reduce your regulatory risk and have just a few choices and which are very, very controlled? So let's maybe here, because why don't we go first to Jessica? Can you go on to the next slide, please? Before we get into this debate, let's have a poll and see what people think, because now you have basically 4 different options: mandatory, optional dynamic tariff with but set by the regulators, or mandatory dynamic tariffs with variety of offerings, or completely flexible, where you have optional dynamic tariffs as well as offerings. So what do you think? What are your preferences? What would you prefer if you were a regulator? Please do answer the poll in the next 30 seconds. Jess, whenever you're ready. It's nice to see that in the previous one we were still at time of use, but then we have the first debate and we come here, and then there is the preference. More than half the people think that we should give complete flexibility to neoliberal economics, to the extreme of complete flexibility to the consumer. indeed very interesting. And I think this is a good point to start the debate, because we also have this question from David and Jim and Alexander, which speak more about, Jim and David for certainly speak more about, what is the best way to adopt dynamic tariffs? But before we get into that, let's go to Tiago first. This time we'll switch the order around. And Tiago, what do you think? Like, should we have mandatory tariffs, or should we go with what the consumers are saying, or what our participants are saying, that give complete flexibility and let people choose?
First, let me answer a question from Tim about the relation between the peak, off-peak, and shoulders in the price, weekly pricing in the spot market, and with the same taxonomy for the white tariff. Actually, is just the relation is there is no relation at all. Just the name is the same. In the spot market, the peak, off-peak, and shoulder is related with the energy price in the spot market, and depends on the availability of renewable sources in the market. And for the white tariff, the name is the same, but you are looking at constraints in distribution capacity. And then there is no relation at all. It's just a confusion that the regulation in Brazil brings in using the same name for different things. Regarding the question of Brad, I think that when you have some certainty about the capacity of the consumer to respond to price signal, the time of use or the real-time price should be mandatory. So when we're talking about large consumers, they have some options to manage the load. So it's important to have the signal in order to flatten the demand and postpone investment. So for large consumers, I think that should be mandatory. But for retail level, it's not. It is need to have an option of the consumers, because not all consumers have the capacity or the ability to respond to price. And therefore, I think that you should have at least default tariffs for different classes of retail consumers. I think that households consumers may manage some kind of load, and the peak of the demand of households is a different one from we look at the small commercial end users. So you should have more than one option for time of use tariffs, depending on the class of the consumers. In Brazil, we have just a single default tariff. That's a problem. And I think that the consumers should have the option to choose between the different options of the white tariff or of the time of use.
Thank you, Tiago. And interesting that you're very clear that you should give give consumer a lot of choice. And I think that's a good place for Teresa, you to intervene. So how much, because you have seen a lot of choice which is being given. So how much choice is should be there for consumers, especially in a era of retail competition, and retail competition being considered more actively across the world, and when really should the regulators step in?
Yeah, I think that it's too many choices is no choice at all. We have this trade-off between the capacity to understand the differences of the utility of the different choices. So I think that the consumers must have at least two choices, but it's maybe important to have three. Two options for time of use and then a flat tariff. In Brazil, it's important to have that. We have to have in mind that there is a cost associated with time of use tariffs, because you're going to need the smart meters. And who's going to bear this cost? Probably the consumers. So it's important to have the choice to have at least two choices, the flat one and the time of use. But I would like to have three, one for households and one for commercial end users.
Okay, Teresa, maybe you should come in because I think you have more than 30 choices.
Yes, we have a lot of choices in Sweden. And we think that it's good that consumers have all these choices, but they also think that it's challenging. And that's where we come in order to, I mean, we help them. We see our role as assisting customers to become aware of their rights, their possibilities, and also responsibilities. And as I mentioned, we run this price comparison site where all the suppliers, they report on their contracts, most common contracts and prices and so on. And we also inform the customers about, for example, how to change electricity supplier, the cost of connecting to the electricity network, the time it should maximum take to have your meter replaced. For example, if you want to take advantage of hourly priced contracts. How do you report your electricity supplier or DSO? Also, we have this telephone support for customers. So we need to see it as important that customers are active and that they feel that they can participate in the market. And we want them to become even more active than what they are today. And our role as facilitating this process and making sure that they are not exploited along the way. I mean, we have this obligation to handle customer. We also talked about vulnerable customers before, and we have an approach. We have a very elaborate social security system in Sweden. So we are, in a way, I mean, vulnerability and vulnerable customers, that those issues are mainly dealt with through the social security system and not so much on the tariff side, so to speak. So that's also maybe a difference in comparison to a lot of other countries in the world that maybe doesn't have that elaborate social security system.
Indeed, it's a very interesting point you make about the social security system, and I mean, and I think it is very important to see where do the vulnerable where do we draw the line, and where do we start protecting the vulnerable customers, and how do we do it? Because, for instance, in India now they are considering having direct benefit transfer to the accounts and then letting the customers pay by themselves. This is something being considered. So, Thomas, how do we protect vulnerable customers? It's surprising, but Europe has a large number of these. And there is a question also in the chat box about the Spanish prices and if it's its impact. So please.
Okay, I would like to separate between vulnerable customers that, for instance, in Spain or in other European countries, they have discounts in the consumption. What it is the default tariff design that also in some of the countries in Europe exists. And in both cases, for instance, the discussion between if we introduce dynamic prices or how to protect those customers. For instance, I'm going to introduce the example in Spain. In Spain, we have a default tariff for consumers, residential consumers, smaller than 10 kilowatts of capacity or contracted power. And in that case, during the last years, the default tariff has been a real-time tariff because what has been done is the price is totally related to the price in the wholesale market, and the margin for the supplier or the regulated supplier is regulated. Therefore, this price is very competitive. And because the wholesale market in Spain is functioning clearly in a very good, this is functioning well, the prices that the consumers already have, because also the regulated supplier margin is very, very attractive. Therefore, still there are many residential consumers under this default tariff. But on the other hand, vulnerable consumers in Spain, they have a reduction there are some attributes that you have to demonstrate that you meet that attributes, and in that case, you are going to have a reduction of 25% of the price of the electricity. And this is kind of protection system, as we have heard from Sweden. There they have the social security system. In the case of Spain, we have this reduction of the payments in the electricity bill. And that is working. But what I would like to tell you is that, in my opinion, there is a part in the tariff what is related with the policy cost and with the residual cost in networks that should be fixed. And in this part of fixed tariffs, we can introduce the equity principle that we want to introduce in the tariffs. And that would be the most efficient way of doing these things. I mean, if we go to fixed charges for residential consumer or other consumers and paying those stranded costs, fixed policy costs and residual network costs, in that case, we will introduce there the separation between customer categories according to equity issues. And we can separate between vulnerable customers or not vulnerable customers. Also, in Spain has been debate what is the reduction in the payments for the electro-intensive industries. And that would be, in my opinion, the efficient way of introducing this separation. And of course, this is the role of regulators. The regulator has to decide how to allocate those things, which is different from what we were discussing previously, which is the market prices and the price contracts or dynamic price contracts associated to the market, which is a different issue.
It's interesting, and I think Thomas, you're proposing something which is in contrast with what Teresa just said about having the social security pot taking care of the electricity vulnerable customers. Teresa, what do you think about this other approach? And then after you, I will let Tiago sum up with his comments and what he can take away for Brazil.
Sorry. Okay.
Teresa
first.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, I think, having the social security system take care of it demands an elaborate social security system. So it really calls for having that it's stable and that it's that people trust the system and that it works basically. Otherwise, you need to work through other means. We also see that digitalization and new technologies, they offer new opportunities for customers actually to participate in the market. One can be quite innovative when it comes to payment methods, how often you pay your bill, for example, if you use the new technologies that are available. So I think reducing customer choice, for example, wouldn't necessarily protect customers, but you have to work with the different options that you have at hand.
Tiago, finally, for you to sum up this part of the debate before we move on, what do you think of the two options that you have?
Okay, the problem when you have too much option is that most of the consumers will just choose the first one that was presented to them. That is well demonstrated in economic behavior science. So there is a important job for the regulator to set the default that you have to be presented as a first option to the consumer to be at least neutral. And if possible, to be the best solution for that kind of consumers. So if you have different categories for consumers with a shape of the demand and of the consumption that you are well understood about the regulator, it's possible to set a default tariff that will be the first one to be presented as to the consumers to have the choice. This is important if you have too much choices in place. And I would just want to answer a question from Sara Pisianato. In my perspective, there is a difference. She is asking about how you can oblige free sellers, retail, and consumers to use a time of use tariff. Actually, in the liberalized, in the free market, we don't have tariff, we have prices. Tariff is a price set by a regulator. So if there's this price, it's bilateral contract. There is no say about how to oblige anyone to use a different agreement for the prices. But in the tariff it's set by the regulator. By definition, a tariff is not a free price. So it's possible to have this. It's important to have this difference about the taxonomy. The price is different from tariff.
Right. Thank you, Tiago, for making that interesting differentiation. But Thomas, before we move on to the last point of our discussion, do you have any words to say in 1 minute? There is a question from Eleonora about regulated dynamic tariff as an obligation for suppliers to offer. So, is that something which is happening in Spain, that it's obliged to provide dynamic tariffs?
Well, what it is, there was another question that is related to that. I was reading in the panel, in the question and answers box, and it's related that in Spain, I think, is the only country in the world that the default tariff is a real-time price tariff, which is something amazing, because what happened in the past was that the default tariff was set by regulated suppliers, and they go to the future market or within 3 months in advance and buy energy there, and the premium for that was increasing and increasing. Therefore, finally, the government decided to say, well, the default tariff is the real-time price that you have in the market. Unfortunately, because we have a full deployment of smart meters in Spain, that has been already implemented, and also because the supplier regulated margin is very competitive, I would say. Suppliers are always complaining about that. It's very competitive. Therefore, the default tariff is almost half of the population in Spain enjoy this default tariff, and it's a real-time price. What happened now with the crisis, for instance, of the COVID, is that the prices in the market are so low that we are enjoying of that part. It's true that it's only 35% of the bill because it's only the energy part, but in some way it's quite beneficial. What had not happened, but probably could happen in the future, having the opposite. You can imagine during 3 months with very high prices in the market, that is going to be a revolution. Therefore, I don't think that this is the real solution. But what it is clear is that real-time pricing should be implemented also with being the consumers aware that the risks that are implicit on that should be well managed by themselves or by the suppliers, right?
Indeed, and with the COVID crisis now, we are not sure about what the future is going to look like. So I will now, Jess, can we go on the last slide, please? So now I will put you in the spot and ask you how the future should look. What do you think the future looks? We are in a world of disruptions even before COVID, but now there is COVID here. We can go to Teresa first, and we had a lot of questions in the Q&A, indirectly, directly, asking about the future and how much more. What is the next step? Do you go for? You spoke about, did speak about the dynamic, moving dynamic tariffs to the networks also to get this 40% even higher. So how do you see moving forward for Sweden? Do you stay as it is for now and watch what COVID brings, or are you already planning your next steps and more evolution?
Thank you. Yeah, we're already planning our next steps. It's a very challenging time, but we think also, or we see the energy transition that we're going through is also something that we need to continuously work on. We can't stop because climate change doesn't stop because of the crisis, for example. So we continue our work. We see our increased share of renewables in the Swedish electricity system is also creating challenges for us. We want to stimulate further demand-side flexibility, but also other types of flexibility in the system. So we're working a lot on price signals, and there the network tariff is one important part of it. We see demand-side flexibility as a cornerstone of a well-functioning and sustainable electricity system. So our challenge is to actually improve price signals going all the way through from transmission down to the end user. So we were given a mandate to issue regulations on the tariff design last year, so we are working on it. We have some challenges because network tariffs, it is a challenging topic, and you know that, and it has a lot of lots of discussions and perspectives. We want to stimulate an efficient use of the network, and we want to move towards more cost-reflective tariffs. At the same time, we have these, the political side of the tariff is important. And here, we want to make sure that we don't disadvantage. We have a very tall country, as you know. Sweden is, and we have production in the north and consumption in the south, and it's quite important. The tariff structure is quite important also for the overall growth and development of the country as a whole. So that's we are looking right now at, for example, how to design or how to handle the residual network costs and how to handle that cost component in the tariff design. We're also looking at how it will be an even more higher number of choices for the customer, of course, to have not only all the electricity price contracts to choose from, but also different types of network tariffs to choose from and to choose the right bundle. So it is challenging, but we think it's quite important that we continue our work and that we continue our analysis of how we can move forward using the best technologies available. We're also working on the aggregator setup and the new actors on the European market. It's challenging, but also very important.
Considering the challenges, and a question I saw, I think from Jose Pablo in the chat box, which I think I should take to Thomas, about how can you take advantage of this new flexibility in the network? And the question is more about locational differentiation of distribution tariff networks. I don't think you can answer, Thomas, answer it in 2 minutes, but where do you see the advantages in the future?
Yeah, I think for sure the future is going to be more electric, I would say. And we are going to have a lot of flexible resources at the distribution network that at the same time, they are going to require more electricity. Therefore, how we manage the networks and the flexibility in the networks, I think already is well identified in the new package, in the electricity and the regulation. But this is a very big challenge for regulators in Europe. And the challenge is to decide which are the best flexibility mechanisms. Dynamic tariffs or locational tariffs is a possibility. The other are locational markets for flexibility, procuring flexibility from distribution system operators. There are trade-offs in these decisions, and for sure, I would say that locational markets are more in hands of regulators, while tariffs are more in hands of politicians. Therefore, probably the future will be better managed if we leave the tariffs on the politicians and we go to the flexibility markets as regulators, because I think doing a lot of granularity at tariffs is quite complex in general. Therefore, there are also major decisions. For instance, you have still a completely flat volumetric tariff at the distribution system or at the network. Please revise that, because this is not a good option. There are better options, right? But dynamic tariffs and distribution are going to be also very complicated. Therefore, I would say that a combination between something more cost reflective at distribution could be more capacity-based tariffs, even with some granularity at the times, I mean, with time blocks, that could be an option. But then with the flexibility, with the problems that we will have at the distribution side, going through local markets and flexibility markets for that.
Indeed, and that is a perfect way to come to you, Tiago. We see all these futuristic things. At the same time, Thomas does warn us about the regulator versus politician battle, which we see in a lot of emerging economies. So what do you think? We have chances to leapfrog regulatorily? What will you suggest to your friends at ANIL or maybe at CRC in India or wherever?
I think that leapfrogging is our only chance. So it's not an option. You have to look for and work hard to have the leapfrogging. Countries, emerging economies have no money to spend in developing new designs, new technologies, new markets. So you need to just stay at 2 or 3 steps behind, looking at the countries that have the money to develop the solutions and the technology. Understand that, not commit the same mistakes, because there's impossible to have a new solution for market or new technology without commit a lot of mistakes, and mistakes are costly. So the best strategy is just to copy, and to copy means leapfrogging is just a fancy name for that. So I think Brazil, India, South Africa, most of the countries that are in the middle between the poor countries and the poor economies and developed ones, and the other countries that are struggling to have money to have a better energy sector, leapfrogging, it's just copy, but understand the problems and translate it to your context, to our background. It's not possible just to use a solution from Sweden and from Spain in Brazil. You need to understand the backgrounds, the frameworks, the regulatory implications, but it's the only way. We need to leapfrogging because we are lying behind. And the best solution is not to try to lead the race, but just to stay near to the leaders.
I think, and we don't have time for more reactions because we are really perfectly on time right now, but I think, Tiago, you put it perfectly. Be pragmatic, learn from the Swedish and the Spanish and the European experience, and then use it better in your own context. So probably Teresa is paying a little bit for Tiago's experiences, but I think that worked with renewables and with Europe taking the lead with renewable energy technology, and Germany with its great renewable program of the past decade. So hopefully even it will work in this. I think we probably saw from our participants as well that dynamic tariff is something that is interesting, that needs to be explored further, applied, studied, sandboxed. So with that, I would like to, Jess, can we go on the last slides? I would like to thank our participants for being here, our panelists for this great discussion. And now I will cede the floor to Jess for the final comments. And thank you very much. And if you have more questions, please do write to us.
I'd just like to thank everyone as well. And I'd like to just bring your attention to a new online course we're having at the Florence School on electric vehicles, a power sector perspective. The faculty is a great lineup of global experts on the topic, and you can learn more on our website or by clicking the link in the screen. There is an early bird discount if you register in the next couple of days, so just pay attention to that. And thank you very much for joining us. Have a wonderful day, and thank you to the great panelists for the discussion.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Fred. Thomas, Teresa. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.